Welcome to one more episode of Overlap This Conversation from across the world. In this case, the first one of 2026. And we need to say that the year has started with some great world commotion with this flagrant violation of international law, the U.S. attack on Venezuelan soil, and the kidnapping of the constitutional president, Nicolás Maduro. Of course, we cannot do anything but speak on this topic and try to understand how it's being perceived. A few days have gone by. There's a lot to say. There's been a lot on the world narrative, and it's a great place to just come out and talk and see how we're looking at this from Latin America and from China. So hello, Tianchen, welcome back, and thank you for joining us. Of course, for Latin America, this has been a tremendous hit just because it's a first for many generations, and it's a first in decades. So we are trying to digest this and really try to understand at an international level what this means going forward. So we'll go into it in a bit. I wanted to ask you, how are you perceiving what happened here from China? There's been a lot of narratives, of course, from the US and from the global South, trying to explain what is really happening. What do you think is the explanation, the narrative for what happened that is most common in China right now?
Sure. The narrative is mixed. Here's a little bit background information because China's mass media and social media has been ridiculously underdeveloped for a long time. A lot of people, they're working in media, in education, and in the broader political or economic sectors. They are loyal followers of the US. So these people, they remain a very loud voice on Chinese internet, on Chinese media. Fortunately, this trend has just begun to shift in recent years as more and more ordinary people no longer trust them and start to question the American discourse and also the entire neoliberal system. So people are coming to understand the truth about the long history of US thuggery in Latin America and across the global South. For me, personally, I was not at all surprised by the recent incident because I am fully aware of the pure evil nature of US government for a long time. I have already expected that they were capable of carrying out anything I could imagine as the worst possible acts. Last year, I was in a conference focusing on decolonization in Africa, and on that meeting, a former US Congresswoman stated that if necessary, the US would kill everyone in that room. And also, other representatives from African countries also said that whenever their country elected a leader, but it's not aligned with US interests, then the US finds ways to remove or eliminate the leader. So that's what they have been doing for a long time. Between 1945 and 1989, excellent American scholar counted 64 covert regime change operations by the US, mostly CIA-led, and also 6 overt regime change operations, meaning an open war to topple another government. So the US had been threatened to overthrow the government of Venezuela for already over 2 decades. This time, they just snatched Maduro has made more and more Chinese people recognize the true nature of the US, of their governments. So a lot of people like me are very concerned about how are the people in Venezuela doing right now. So Belen, I saw some news reporting that people are pretty anxious. They line up on the streets for grocery, for gas all day long. So what sentiments are most visible there, and how much has their daily life been disrupted? What are people's main concern right now?
Of course, we need to understand, I think, from a very personal level, the day-to-day life of every people. One thing I always want to to bring to the table to whoever has not been in Venezuela before is that December is a very special time for Venezuelans. Venezuelans love celebrating Christmas. It's a party out on the streets. Caracas just shifts colors when December starts because it's culturally a very significant month of celebration and happiness. And it's not crazy to think that it's this time of year just after the holidays that they are choosing to do this attack, particularly because it will come as such a shock after a moment of joy in the street. We had been reporting on the exceptionality. We need to think that the aggressions and the threats have been mounting from the United States upon Venezuela from at least last part of last year, from August onwards. And the past months have been constant threats. People waking up every day to Western news outlets, main news outlets, every day just publishing things like the attack is coming, it's going to be now, maybe not, maybe tomorrow. And that what Venezuela is naming a psychological war has to do with the effect that has on the people. And we had been reporting about the exceptionality that actually most parts of Venezuela were continuing their normal life, and there are videos just up to like one day before the attack of the Christmas parties, the holidays parties on the street, people dancing in squares, the city fully lit up. I'm talking about Caracas, but of course other parts of the country as well. So we need to try to picture the sentiment and the commotion of a people that are going from that experience on the streets to a full-blown attack, waking up to explosions. And we were just talking about this off air. Latin America and the Caribbean has been for the longest time recognized as a zone of peace. It was formally declared by the members of the region as a zone of peace in 2014 in a meeting in Havana. But it goes further than that. It's the idea that it was a region not involved in direct armed conflicts as other regions of the world have been. And that was very important to the life of locals, Latin American and Caribbean people in general, that beyond the difficulties of this region, our generations had not experienced this before. But the region does have, and you were saying, a long history of direct or indirect forms of interventions. So older generations do remember that this has happened before. It happened in Panama in the year 89. It happened in Grenada in the 83. But we're talking about decades ago. So if you're asking about how Venezuelans are feeling right now, we're recording from Cuba, but a lot of our comrades are in the different parts of Venezuela. And first of all, we need to understand it's a moment of commotion. People are digesting, and the authorities came out right hours after this happened to say this. This is a country that is processing an attack as one that these generations have never seen before, that Latin American soil has not seen before, at least in the past long decades. So that's the first thing. Of course, people are anxious. Of course, people are trying to figure out what is happening, because that's the normal reaction that you would have from someone that you're dropping bombs on, and that we're just coming out from one of the more joyful celebrations, even though they had been suffering this psychological constant threat. So first of all, of course, there's that dimension that we need to keep in mind. Then right after that, one of the most important things is the situation. It's a calm situation right now. Calm situation, and with mobilizations that we've been seeing in defense of the territory. And this has been something that Venezuelans have been working towards through this period of psychological threat. The idea that, okay, the government used to phrase it in this way: before the constant threats, Venezuela will prepare its people. People will have maximum preparation. So this idea that it was already in the air, the possibility that if something happened, well, people had to come out to the streets to defend the territory, to defend sovereignty. And we need to say that many sectors of the social life of Venezuela have a very long tradition. They have decades of tradition of popular organization, territorial organization. So it is not a people not used to coming out to defend what's theirs. It's not people that are not used to being constantly attacked at an international level. And this decades long, from the beginning of Chavez government until this point, decades long of constant harassment, well, it teaches the people something. So those who are there in the territory, those who have lived through the whole thing, I think that they are now showing the true most resilient colors, because what we are seeing from the streets, many narratives before anything happened, you would see in a lot of Western media, these possibilities of like putting a possible attack from the US on Venezuela as if it was going to be just a very simple thing, going in, toppling a government, the people would come out, rebel against everything, and everything would change. And a lot of analysts, even US analysts, even MAGA analysts, were saying that is not the case. Like, that process has a lot of like popular base, popular support. Even if you do this sort of attack, it's people are going to still be there, still be able to fight and defend the process. And what we're seeing now on paper, despite what media was saying before, is that is what is happening, that people are processing this very aggressive attack that directed the kidnapping of a constitutional president, which is something that crosses all major like international red lines. And the situation on the streets is of mobilization, not against a supposed government. That was what the Western media was supposedly advertising. We're seeing mobilizations in defense of that land. We're seeing mobilizations in defense of that territory. And most of all, we're seeing mobilizations in rejection of such an attack. And that, it was to be expected. Like, what will people do if you're bombing their territory? They're going to come out and say, we're not going to stand for this. So all of that is happening at the same time. And it's been days. So of course we need to keep track of what is happening. But I think that past the first hours, we are seeing a people and a government, because the institutionality, and this is something to look for, institutionality has not been broken. Yesterday, the National Assembly began its new session period. The acting president, following the constitutional president Maduro's orders, acting president was sworn in order to be able to fulfill the duties. Institutionality continues and social life continues. So that is a show of great resilience for a people that have just been bombed. All of that is something to keep in mind. Now, Tianchen, first of all, are these images, are these sentiments coming across to China? Are you seeing like these images of the mobilizations? How are people like understanding what is happening right now? And also, one of my questions was, how is China looking at the like true motives behind this this attack? Because you know that a lot of the narratives and a lot of the political analysis, the deeper analysis that are trying to understand what's happening, they are saying that a lot of what's at play here is actually the United States trying to heavily condition the possibility of Latin America getting closer to China. Like that Latin America and the Caribbean is becoming a battleground, and now a literal battleground in the dispute, in the way that the US is trying to fight back for China. So how are you seeing that from your perspective?
Sure. Thanks for sharing so much details and facts about what's going on in Venezuela. That's what we actually care about. For what is the strategic thinking behind the US moves, I think China should be part of the reason, but not the whole picture. Over the past 6 months, as you just mentioned, like the situation in Venezuela has become increasingly tense. Last month, the U.S. Finally released their updated national defense strategy documents. A lot of people at that time interpreted it as a major pivot in U.S. foreign policy, with U.S. beginning a period of strategic pullback. But I would see it only as a minor shift. While the U.S. has emphasized a lot about safeguarding its interest in the Western Hemisphere, it has not made any clear commitment to scale back its role in the Eastern Hemisphere. It only signals that the methods of intervention and sanctioning may change. So now I see that's what Trump and his administration is trying to do now. All things are connecting. It's not even pretending a commitment to a rule-based order or a neoliberal crusade to promote liberal democracy. It's just showing a power-based order. So the strong can do whatever they can, and the weak suffer what they must. So I can see we are just at the beginning of a prolonged period of turbulence, danger, and instability. And Latin America is definitely at the very front, but it's not that it's fighting alone. It's actually, it will involve the whole world, involving China, involving Russia, and every major power, and even the smallest country. But I don't think it may end up well for the U.S. This longer term game of regime change will still be risky, as you're told that the institution is still there in Venezuela and the people are showing very strong resilience. So as far as I can understand, historically, the aftermath of such operations have been chaotic and violent for both sides. But definitely we will see that the people will be hurt the most.
Yes, and one of the things that you were just mentioning was this thing about the narratives and the supposed way of like selling to the world an idea that we're doing this for democracy, we're doing this for freedom, and that has been a constant when the US is trying to sort of cover up this regime change operations. And it really speaks of a new moment in the world that we really need to pay like close attention to regarding this new type of government. I'm thinking not only Donald Trump, but also Israelis Netanyahu, these people that are not even just doing the effort to cover this with like talking of democracy and freedom. They're just coming out and saying what they are going to do. And you will see a discourse in Trump, just first of all, a very back and forth narrative. If anyone that has been closely following everything that the United States has said from August, when they started building up its military pressure in the Caribbean until this point, they have been going back and forth and back and forth. It's drug trafficking, it's the government, it's oil. No, it's drug trafficking again. It's actually narco-terrorism. It's because of the oil. They owe us the oil. It's like going back and forth, just trying to find different angles. and not creating like one single narrative. Of course, for anyone who's deeply looking at it, that comes out as completely false and fake because it's something that it's changing every time. We could say maybe, well, that's a new communication strategy that speaks to the new world we're living in. Most of these discourses are just being shared in social medias through very small clips, and whatever works is like the short bit of a clip that then will get viral. Nobody's keeping track of if that's the same thing that was said yesterday, 2 months ago, or if it will be completely like left behind in 2 days. It just creating a sensationalist clip. So definitely those narratives are changing, but in the end, it's what you were saying. We're still seeing all these major operations that are trying to get a regime change. They've also said, like they've gone back and forth in the United States within their own Congress, because we do not need to forget that this is opening serious like fissures within the United States itself, and not only between the Republicans and Democrats, within the Republican Party as well. That's a party that has said didn't want any major foreign operations. They were supposed to be America first again, so that the money would be focused inside. So they have said, like, this is a regime change operation. No, it's not. Well, yes, maybe it is. We need to do it. It's oil. Again, a lot of back and forth, and this is leading what is happening right now. Now, one of the things that I think it's very important to understand is mobilizations right now in Venezuela and across the world. And I think we need to continue to look at both things, because that will be one of the key aspects to see what happens in the future. It was the same thing for Palestine. The pressure that mobilizations, both inside Venezuela and outside in different parts of the world, will put on the international community to try to like make this right and try to enforce international law that is being completely violated. Those mobilizations have two key points. And number one for Venezuela is the return of the constitutional precedent. We are at this moment, not just Venezuela, the whole world. And I think that is the important thing to keep in mind. It's not an attack on Venezuela. The possibility that the United States is opening, that a government can directly go and kidnap the president of another government, a member of the United Nations, that had been going to the Security Council for the past month saying, they are going to attack us. They are going to attack us. Like, hello, what is happening? And nothing was happening. And they go and take a constitutional president, and now they have it kidnapped with his wife, who's also a member of the National Assembly of Venezuela, Cilia Flores. The fact that that is possible in this world is not just an attack on Venezuela, it's an attack on the entire system of international stability. So what happens, like what mechanisms of pressure does the different people of the world have in order to try to enforce, like push back and say, no, we have international laws, we have like a stability system, this cannot just pass by? That pressure internationally, so we're seeing mobilizations in different parts of the world, and also locally from Venezuela, because they're defending that territorial integrity. That will define what is coming in the coming hours, and it will define if, as you were saying, if this goes right for the US or not. Because Trump immediately wanted to come out and say that this was a very easy thing, just something to go, they were so superior that they could do it almost in the blink of an eye. Well, we are seeing now that there's been a lot of confrontations. One important piece of information to keep in mind as well is that there were 32 fallen Cuban soldiers in the attack So Cuba is putting a lot of the victims there. Again, always a great partner in the defense of the global South and the integrity of these nations, once again putting their lives at risk against imperialism. When we're seeing a people that are standing up, asking for their president to come back, asking for their territory to be defended, institutionality has not been broken. So now we need to see if this international pressure continues to mount, if this campaign has been as easy, quick, as successful as Trump is trying to sell it. And in many cases, what will define it is people out in the streets, both inside Venezuela and outside Venezuela. That was a game changer for Gaza. Even if the killings continue, even if the genocide is ongoing, what definitely put pressure on the situation in Gaza to stop was the constant mobilizations and governments starting to feel that the people themselves were pressuring them to, like, you need to stop supporting this. This cannot continue to happen. Well, we need to see what's happening in this case now. Like, are people around the global South going to allow for a world in which just a major power can come out and kidnap a president and take it back? Like, is that the new world we're living in? Because that changes everything for all of us. How is this being discussed in China?
I think at this moment, most Chinese people, much like the Chinese government, we may tend to believe there's not a lot of things we can act right now is due to a lot of historical complex reasons. People tend to believe that China's policy toward Venezuela, as well as the Latin America, should still focus primarily more on the economic aspect. Politically, the Chinese government is continuing to explore the point at which it can be more assertive or more aggressive on the international stage. However, as we all see, the global conditions are changing rapidly. So some people start to think that this policy trajectory may not last long. It may change in the next few years because this situation in Venezuela, again, shows how much a new world order is desperately needed. So I'm not sure what is going to happen in the next stage, but I really hope that we will see some fundamental change in the next episode.
And now you were, Tianchen, mentioning before that you personally were seeing this as completely coherent with other actions that the U.S. has taken in the past, that for you personally, and I assume other sectors of Chinese society, this does not come as a surprise. And you were also saying that there's another big portion of society that closely follows the Western media, that closely follows the U.S., and I assume that there's other narratives going around in that case. What do you think that is, like, what are people thinking about the legitimacy of this action? I don't know, at least here it's like social media are going on about this, like back and forth. What do you think people are perceiving, like out on the streets? If you go and ask someone, like, is this something that's okay? Is this something that's a little bit crazy?
I think most people in China would believe, especially like for the ordinary people, they would believe that the Trump administration is like totally unhinged and it's a complete violation of international law. But if you go for like social media, mass media, there may be some debating going on, and there may be some part of people, especially the ones I just talked about, if working in certain industries, they are still like totally following the U.S. narrative. But I don't think their strategy is going to work for a long time, because as the Trump administration is like much further, and they are doing they are like keep like breaking people's previous anticipation and keep showing they're like totally power politics. So it will be like more and more people go against that narrative, but started to think about like we should bring back the already kind of like forgotten by the US people, like the UN Charter, and also bring back the power of the international law and things like that. So it's still going on. Yeah, it's not a clear result at this moment, but I can see the trend is going through that direction.
Right. And of course, around the world, this is just leading to so much debate. And I think that's where like communication tools have the opportunity of giving that debate and showing these conversations and just giving arguments and information for people to continue to debate on this. And I was thinking that the United States has been talking about taking over or running Venezuela. That was the words, right, that Trump used, that Marco Rubio used on that infamous press conference after the attack. Of course, there's a lot of show in that, right? It is one of their characteristics. They come out, they do this great show, they act like they're the popular kids in school, and a little bit bullying the entire world. And that's sort of like the feeling. But the words that they used, the idea behind it was, yes, we are running Venezuela now. Something that it's very important to say, they are not. Like, there is no foreign control in the territory right now in Venezuela. As we were saying, institutionality has maintained itself. Of course, after a great hit, they kidnapped the constitutional president. I think it's a good time for us to think, like everywhere around the world, what institutionality is strong enough that if from an hour to the next one, a foreign major power came in and kidnapped the constitutional president, institutionality would continue to run smoothly and just follow the chain of command and continue to enforce the political project and see how they go from there. That takes a lot of strength. That takes like an institutionality that is truly solid. So that is something also to keep in mind for a lot of Western narratives that are always trying to frame Latin American institutional systems as systems that are very weak, like they go from one thing to the other. Like there's a world narrative that sort of frames global South systems as less strong than northern systems that are supposed to be very strong and very civilized. And yet you see that in a couple of years ago, you had MAGA taking over the Capitol, not wanting to accept an election in the United States, supposedly the strongest political system. And in this case, what you're seeing is a foreign power kidnapping a president and institutionality continuing days afterwards, like without breaking point at this moment. So that is one thing to keep in mind, how that goes like against the narratives that are usually used. But they're talking about running Venezuela. And I kept thinking of like the importance that China gives to sovereignty, the importance that China gives to like internal affairs, right? The One China principle is one of the most important things in terms of its foreign relations and maintaining that sovereignty over the territory. How do you think like people in China in general are perceiving, like what do they understand when they hear a foreign president saying, oh yes, actually we went there and now we're gonna run that country? Like what does that mean?
Yeah, we are sure that Trump certainly wants to take over of Venezuela, but people are keep asking. The real question is, whether it actually has the capacity to do it, in what form. As you just said, I'm glad to confirm with you that again, that the domestic resistance inside Venezuela has not been seriously weakened. It's still there. It's still functioning. The U.S. has spent years trying to pressure and suppress Venezuela, yet it has failed to bring the country under effective control. This in itself suggests that the anti-U.S., anti-imperialism forces within Venezuela remain relatively strong. So if Trump were to overreach and impose direct military control over Venezuela, it could easily turn into quagmire similar to the Afghanistan war. From the perspective of the U.S. national interest, such an intervention would require enormous investments while yielding very limited results. So even American people themselves questioning the effectiveness of this incident. Foreign Affairs just published an article arguing that during the negotiation in the summer of 2025, Maduro had already met nearly all the Washington economic demands. I'm not sure if it's true, but the article argues that the recent kidnap of the president, however, has undermined those hard-won economic gains, pushed Latin American allies towards opposition, and risks dragging the U.S. again into another prolonged conflict from which it will be very difficult for them to extricate itself. So that's what American people themselves sees this conflict. So even then has no confidence of actually take over the Venezuela. So I was wondering like how the local people perceive the image of Maduro at this time, because there are like many rumors circulating on Chinese internet, like people are arguing that what kind of people is Maduro is he should be responsible for Venezuela's economic hardship, or is actually he's actually challenging the global neoliberal system. So how does people there view Maduro?
Of course. And of course, when we are analyzing and trying to understand a process, a person worldwide, there's a lot of things to keep in mind, and it's always very complex. So, but we can go into some ideas and some data to at least give us a perspective that counters Western media are trying to impose. And with Venezuela in particular, what Western media has been constant and trying to reflect like a single image that speaks of a government and a people, and they're just trying to put it in one light, and they're trying to show an image of a people that are completely rejecting that process and sort of like hijacked by a process. That's like the Western media narrative outside of Venezuela. That's what the far-right opposition of Venezuela has also tried to collaborate with that idea, that media. And for example, figures like far-right opposition leader Marina Corina Machado that has been very active trying to show this idea of Venezuela worldwide. And the Western world and Western powers have been standing by that idea that, of course, now we see was just a way to sort of allow for this to happen, right? Allow for an attack like this to happen, and international solidarity trying to now have to counter that narrative. But if we see what's happening on the ground, we see that what they were saying would happen is not happening. Like, if the population was being hijacked by one crazy man. Well, supposedly, if you took away that crazy man, you would have the people coming out in freedom and trying to, like, okay, we have our country now. That is not what's happening. The mobilizations in Venezuela at this moment are very significant. Again, we're not recording from Venezuela, but we have a lot of comrades in Venezuela. We've been talking to our friends and colleagues in Venezuela. The mobilizations in different points, and particularly in Caracas, have been massive. You can go and check the images, and they are mobilizations asking for the return of President Nicolás Maduro, and they are mobilizations asking for the defense of the territory. The National Assembly sessioned yesterday with the majority ruling party and the democratic opposition, because that is something that the Western narrative also always wants to leave outside the scope, that you can go and check the discourses and the live recordings of National Assembly yesterday in Venezuela. The democratic opposition is there. It is not a single party system. You have people that are playing within the institutional powers that are part of that political life, and they are also saying that they are against the foreign intervention and against the bombing of Venezuela. And those who were trying to frame this international narrative that you were alluding to from the outside, those who were trying to sell the idea that this, like, people were demanding an intervention because something like that, like Venezuela has to be saved. Well, they could never prove that they had a base to back that up. And that is so true that in the press conference of a few days ago, President of the United States, Donald Trump, and Marco Rubio, definitely not friends of the Venezuelan people right now, came out and say, well, Maria Corina Machado was like, nice lady, but she cannot run Venezuela right now. Because what they were trying to show that they were the true representatives of the people, even the United States is saying, like, no, you're not. Because if you go there, you're not going to have a base to rule right now. So maybe in this, like, journalistic communication war that we're living in which you have, like, major media outlets constantly fighting to impose one single narrative, I think that the best thing that we can do to understand what is really happening is to try to monitor what really happens on the ground. And what really happens on the ground right now is that you have mobilizations asking for the return of that president, that you have mobilizations asking for the rejection of those, of that aggression and the rejection of that intervention. And of course, if you had a portion of the far-right opposition outside of Venezuela asking for that intervention, that is not very popular for the people inside Venezuela. Like, one thing is to be calling for bombs to fall on a country if you're outside, but if you're inside and you are trying to pick up your economic life, also one thing to keep in mind, and everyone can go and check numbers, like official numbers from multilateral organisms, economical activity in Venezuela had been rising from a very hard spot that the sanctions in its major industry had put it in. For the past years, it had been recovering economical activity. And that, for anyone who visited Venezuela in the past years, that was clear and it was obvious. And people there, if you're getting your life back, if you're getting your economic activity back, you do not want to leave that truck. Like, you do not want, like, yet another attempt, and in this case with bombs and a direct aggression, to push you out of that path of seeing that you're getting a little bit better day by day. So all of these things need to keep in mind. And also, one last thing, it's very difficult because the discussion of what is happening in Venezuela is always involving as well the perception outside of Venezuela. And as we look at the international scene, we need to sort of try to balance both. Another of the important points to keep in mind, and I think that it will be the job of journalism moving forward. It should have been for the past month, and many of us have done so. The charges that they're putting, like the supposed charges they're putting on the Venezuelan authorities, those linked to drug trafficking and the pretext of the war on drugs, are like complete. From the very beginning, the whole narrative of the war on drugs did not match the same reports, not Venezuelan data, it did not match US data, it did not match the United Nations data. It was completely baseless. You had Trump throwing away numbers like every ship we're destroying is saving I don't know how many thousand lives. And you went to actual reports on the flow of illicit drugs towards the United States, and it was not coming from those routes in the Caribbean. So all of this also needs to come back to the discussion over the image of the figure of Nicolás Maduro. Like, there is a narrative that they're trying to impose, but the actual data is not backing that narrative. So basically the discussion has to go in place of, are we going to be won over by viral TikToks, or are we going to be able to like go deeper into the data and the information to have like a broader discussion? And just the final thing to understand that sentiment in Venezuela right now is this project, the Chavez project, continued by Nicolás Maduro. It's a project that has an enormous social appeal on at least a very significant sector of Venezuela, and particularly in a very significant popular sector of Venezuela. And that appeal, that emotional closeness and sentiment with a political project that many believe have changed their lives, not materially, but it's a process that in the past years in particular, for example, mobilized forces in favor of people being in charge of their own territories. So you have old ladies, picture this, like old ladies that like in some rural town in Venezuela are being able to decide like to get together and how are they going to use those resources to better handle the issues that they have within the community, and getting to work every morning and being able to solve that. And that gives them an amount of dignity and power over their own land that is truly part of that social process. That aspect is many times overlooked. Like that connection that people have with that project and that those representatives that led them there is very profound. So anyone who is not taking that into account is not understanding what is really happening in Venezuela. And they will not understand why, when even if they kidnap the leader, that process is much bigger than that. So definitely we'll need to continue to see, but all of that is at play. And my idea, you can maybe tell me what you perceive, but my idea is that Western media, and sadly, when I say Western media, I'm talking about media mostly controlled by Europe and the United States, is not capturing this. Like, it's not showing even like a 5% of this. You hear Venezuela and you hear like 2-3 words, and none of them are speaking on like this aspects of what is happening right now. And I think that if we do not take into account these aspects, we cannot understand why you see the streets of Caracas filled with people demanding for his return.
I'm so glad that in China, people get to see the two side story, and we have the debating going on and the truths that coming from through the process of debating. For example, the whole stories around Maduro, there are some like very famous scholars coming to write some articles accusing Maduro of ruining Venezuela's economy. They say that because Maduro promoted excessive government spending, large-scale nationalization, and economic nationalism, thereby destroying the whole economy. However, immediately there are some other scholars and also influencers on the internet coming to push back against this narrative, and they cited historical data, pointed out that this narrative only closely mirrors the accusation made by the U.S., made by the Europe mainstream media, and they serve to just to stigmatize socialist economic policies. In reality, the primary source of Venezuela's crisis lies in the long-term pressure and sanctions imposed by the United States. So those people who took the Western narratives, they always ignore the all these repressions and all these sanctions imposed by the U.S. imperialism, but they only accuse from Chavez to Maduro, only blame them for destroying the whole economy, but not to even mention a word of the U.S. So I'm very glad that we get to see not the single narrative, but the two sides of the story, and people get to tell the truth.
And also, from what you were saying, that's a great point to get into. And of course, like, we are not economic experts. Hopefully, maybe we could have at one of these conversations, like someone to have like more specialized view on the economy in particular. But two great aspects of what you were saying to keep in mind, again, that are always outside Western narrative is, first of all, of course, Venezuela, up to at least a few years ago, was heavily dependent on the oil industry because it was one of its major resources. But this was not just because, they didn't want to do anything else. Like, they're just gonna exploit, because sometimes there's like this narrative that tries to picture this as like a strange decision. They didn't think that they could do anything else. It is part of the world economic structure that will leave global South countries, specifically in Latin America, but we can think that Africa happens the same thing, as countries whose economy need to be heavily dependent on their one natural or two natural resources, and that their only way to enter the global market is by extracting and heavily depending on that natural resource. And it's the job of the global north to buy that, process that, have the most heavily produced goods over that, and therefore always being able to have the largest profits on that. That is part of the global international order that has always reproduced this dominance of the North over the South. So when we are talking about South American country and the difficulties it had leaving an economy that was strongly dependent on a primary good, it is completely oblivious to live outside the fact that the entire world order is putting Latin America in that position. You can think about this with other countries and their other main resources. The thing is that Venezuela in particular, it's oil. And it's one of the largest traded upon commodities, and so that puts it with a greater extra value. But all South American countries are pushed by the international order into only fostering that sort of primary good economy. And it's a very difficult process, a process that many governments in Latin America have tried to do with many difficulties. The process of coming out of that into a more better distributed economy and a more developed economy in terms of manufacturing, so that they would not be so dependent on that like initial activity. Because being so dependent on that initial activity makes you much more vulnerable to the rest of the world, because you are dependent on the global north for so much more. So putting that as a fault of the Venezuelan administration is very strange if you're not thinking about the position that the global south in general is put in. And it even more strange if you do not take into account, as you were saying, how the sanctions particularly target that economy. So, of course, every project, and it has been part of the recent years of the Venezuelan administration to understand, like, okay, this is directly from the government statements of the last years. We were heavily dependent on the oil industry. We are working on better distributing, and now we have all these other engines of the economy in motion, and that is why they were able to pick up the economic activity, boosting, for example, the production of food in general. Venezuela used to import most of what it was eating, and it started growing in different areas, and with the support of like different exchanges, that growth and that production. Of course, every project needs to look at its difficulties and try to do better every time, but there is no discussion. Like at an international level, it's ill-intended for anyone to try to discuss this without thinking that, first of all, this is a South American country, so its possibilities are limited by the international order, and it's always going to have to try to fight back against that order in order to develop itself, and that it's facing sanctions that are trying to specifically destroy that motor that is like the life vest of the economy. So you cannot think of one thing without the other. It's like thinking about Cuba without thinking about the blockade. Like you cannot think about Cuba without the blockade, because any country in the world facing those types of restrictions would definitely change its way of life. And of course, and drop strategies, and need to see how they overcome it. So these are actually examples that people should be looking at to see, like, okay, if you have all of these restrictions, what do you do? How did they manage? How did they come back from that? How did they persist? We are looking at a world filled with trade. Trump had wanted to unleash this trade war with everyone in the world right now. And we were seeing conversations, bilateral agreements between all the countries, like raising the tariffs, no, like raise 5%, 10%, 50%. And everyone was crazy, like trying to explain, like, no, because if we have 50% tariffs, it's going to cost this and this and this, and it's going to be a debacle. Well, think of receiving over 900 sanctions on your major, like, an engine in your production and your economy. Like, what does that do? If every country is crazy about a 5 or 10% tariff increase, how would they survive all the sanctions targeted to like a single southern economy? Definitely, it's a great conversation to have, the economic factor. It needs to be had with all of these things taken into account. And that's sort of the conversation.
Exactly. It's all connected. Mm-hmm.
It is all connected. So, Tianchen, we are going into a definitely hard couple of weeks and a hard year. You were saying before, like, this is opening a new situation. I think that we're living in a new world ever since the genocide in Palestine became so brutal. I think that shifted all of our perspectives and our world order. And now we are seeing how we deal with that.
Yes, again, I think it shows how much a new world order is desperately needed. And I have full respect for you, and also all of your comrades, and also all these Venezuelans who are working and fighting at the very front line. So you guys are fighting against the most powerful military power, the most sophisticated capitalism system in history at this moment. So I wish you all the best.
And we're doing it together. That's good.
Yes.
Okay, Tianchen, so it was great speaking to you as always. We'll need to speak in a few weeks and see where we stand. Definitely, it was great to have this conversation. We will continue to do so. And for now, this was another episode of Overlap, this conversation from across the world.